Hey there, my name is John Negroni. I'm the film editor for theyoungfolks.com. I also host the Cinemaholics podcast, where you can hear me talk about even more movies in even more detail on a weekly basis with my co-host, Will Ashton of Collider.com. But for now, you're just stuck with me. Right, so, The Batman is a totally new, total reset of the iconic comic book character. Certainly one of the most recognizable and beloved costume heroes of all time. Certainly one of the surest bets that Hollywood can still make when it comes to box office franchises. Like, we can easily compare Batman to Marvel's darling Spider-Man. Now, it's been a while since we received a focused Batman film with just Batman and his carousel of villains and allies and everybody in between. This new take on Batman was directed by Matt Reeves, famous for delivering one of the best trilogies in recent years, in my opinion, that being the Planet of the Apes trilogy, which started with the Rise of the Planet of the Apes back in 2011, I want to say. Now, Reeves co-wrote this screenplay with Peter Craig. He worked on a few of the Hunger Games movies and The Town, that Ben Affleck movie. And speaking of Ben Affleck, I won't bore you with the details, but in a nutshell, this movie had a very, very long, drawn-out production sort of drama kind of thing. They were going to make this movie as far back as like 2013, 2014. I think they announced it 2014. Ben Affleck was going to star and direct the film. It was originally going to be more of like an Arkham Asylum kind of movie. It was going to be more of like slick James Bond, a little bit closer to what we saw in the DCEU with that Batman. However, after everything that happened with the DCEU not quite working after Batman vs. Superman and Justice League, they sort of retooled the thing, and eventually it ended up in Matt Reeves' hands, and it's what we have here. Now, our new Batman is played by Robert Pattinson, who is certainly one of the most exciting young actors working today. So for those of you who may not have watched any of his other roles since he starred in the Twilight films, Pattinson, he's been a mainstay in indie cinema really the last several years, showing up in some truly stellar films like Good Time and The Lost City of Zed and Claire Denis' High Life, which is certainly one of my favorite films from a few years ago, 2019. Now, Pattinson is back in the blockbuster spotlight as a younger Bruce Wayne in his second year of crime fighting. So this is a bit of a blend between a few Batman comics. Now, I'm definitely not an expert, but while watching this, I picked up on year one for sure, especially when it comes to tackling Bruce Wayne, still figuring out how to be Batman. But in terms of the plot, it's really lifting more from The Long Halloween and its sequel, Dark Victory. In fact, I have Long Halloween right here. I forgot that I still had this, and I was like, oh yeah, I might want to reread this at some point because it's been a while. And it's really taking from those in a lot of ways, because the story mainly follows the detective side of Batman. This is a big old detective Batman movie where he and the Gotham PD are trying to solve a string of serial killer murders. But the big change here is that they're going with the Riddler, played by Paul Dano, as the villain instead of the Hangman or the Holiday Killer. I know Riddler was technically in Dark Victory, but not as this. So it's an interesting choice because the film purposely frames Riddler as essentially the Zodiac Killer, which really matches the moody 70s noir action vibe that Reeves is harking from films like The French Connection and Chinatown, while also merging them pretty gracefully actually with David Fincher's Zodiac and the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. The film also stars Jeffrey Wright as Jim Gordon, who's not yet a commissioner, but already a pretty reliable ally of Batman. Zoe Kravitz plays Catwoman, who, similar to Batman, is still kind of finding her way. She's sort of a cat burglar, but also a nightclub waitress, and maybe she deals drugs too. We also have John Turturro as the mob boss Carmine Falcone, since you can't really do year one and have Catwoman without Falcone, or the other way around, right? And Andy Serkis plays Alfred, and he's the usual doting paternal figure. He just sort of needles around in the background of these characters. It's not a bad performance, but I think Alfred in this movie was one of my least favorite elements of the film. Not that it was bad. And Colin Farrell is basically unrecognizable as the Penguin, who in this movie, he's really just a mid-level mobster here, still making a name for himself. First off, the cast here is exactly as good as it sounds, if not better. Pattinson's Batman, and Bruce Wayne for that matter, has a murkier, broodier, more insomniac flavor to his performance. It's almost like he's a man who's addicted to being Batman. Like Batman is a drug. And this all really helps to sell that he's still new at this and still figuring things out. It's a pretty bold story choice because the audience certainly has a good idea of who Batman is already, like what his code code is, how Batman operates, and all that. So there's a bit of catching up that this new version of the character has to do. Thankfully, it comes together pretty well because Pattinson plays the part sort of imperfectly perfect in the unique edge he brings to a man who, in other films, we've seen Bruce Wayne as this smooth, charming billionaire when he's not beating up thugs. But in this movie, he's an emotionally stunted teenage daredevil. It's something we haven't really seen before, and he's like a teenage daredevil in a 30-year-old man's body. It's kind of wild, which of course makes for some really good character development and progression for the character, as he also happens to be a genius born out of his obsession with understanding and trying to undercut crime at its most basic level. I really like that element of the film because it's not just that he's the world's greatest detective because he's just a great detective. It's actually born of like his trauma is so profound and it's so troubling. It sort of gives that detective superpower a bit of a dark side. Like a downside to it is that, oh, he's this smart because he's obsessed, and that obsession is chipping away at his humanity. It's something the film certainly gets super, super down to like a really good level. It's really cool. Now, Zoe Kravitz and Jeffrey Wright round out what I would consider one of the best trios of performance acting we've seen in a Batman film. All three of these actors are so good in each of these roles, only because I think with these two characters in particular, they managed to tug at dueling worldviews as reflection characters for Batman. They're the devil and the angel on his shoulder, yet at the same time, and what I love about this is that they're almost indistinguishable. And as the movie goes on, you see more and more of what the differences are, and that is where I think the film's biggest media substance really is in the dichotomy between Batman's two reflection characters. It's really well done screenwriting. The film also has one of the best car chase scenes ever put to film in the modern era. I won't give anything away, but it is easily the most impressive and spectacular we've seen since Mad Max Fury Road. And much of it is thanks to Colin Farrell's stunning commitment to the Penguin persona, a character who I honestly underestimated in his value to the story up until that moment. Like up until that moment, I was like, does the Penguin really need to be in this? He's not really making much of an impression. And then there you go. Now, this is also some of the better fist fighting action we've seen in any Batman film. It's quite good, although it's not quite at the level of that brilliant warehouse scene in Batman v Superman, which that we really haven't got anything that good in a while in sort of a live action Batman film or otherwise. Overall, the film is a grab bag of story and aesthetic elements that add up to something seriously impressive and thrilling to watch. It's one of those I'm glad this exists kind of movies, similar to Joker, in fact. As I said before, it's David Fincher's Zodiac with Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight kind of perfectly blended together. Like it's half that, with, of course, some of the best crime dramas of the 70s and 80s also sprinkled in there as seasoning. Yet by the end of the film, I had trouble pinpointing why the Batman didn't fully knock me out the way that The Dark Knight or Batman Begins did. It's certainly of a piece with Dark Knight, as I already mentioned. It has that grounded approach, the realistic emotional stakes. It's all there. It's clearly inspired by the grittier, earthier atmosphere that made Joker turn heads, even at the Academy. It's got so much good stuff in it. So what is it? What's the problem? And at first, when I was walking out of the movie, I chalked it up to the length of the film and how it takes quite a long time to actually end. The third act goes on far longer than it's set up for, and structurally the film loses itself after the midpoint, really, when we move into the higher stakes of the second act and we're gearing up for the climax. It's great. And instead, we get a series of mini climaxes, essentially, which made me think that, hey, maybe upon repeated viewings, the film might work much better for me as I see it again. And, it might be more engaging and easier to appreciate once I go into it with all the pieces already put together. That was kind of my experience with Batman Begins, actually. But I do think the problem, the real underlying issue, which maybe is what holds this movie back for me overall, is it's a little bit more complex. For one thing, the Batman as a movie lacks its own identity and point of view, because all these things I've already mentioned, they sound great. They sound like pluses and advantages and all of that. But I guess the downside is that it borrows so heavily from so many other great works that it doesn't really come together to say or be anything all that profound on its own. The same way that we can still quote so many lines of dialogue from The Dark Knight, it just doesn't have those deep, resonant connections to the film's themes like that movie does. It gets really close, and there are certainly themes. Like, it's not like this film isn't about anything. There's even some stuff in there that's pretty relevant to today in terms of people who, like militias and, extremist political stuff. It's there. It's just there was like a missing ingredient. And I think what that ingredient is that the Batman lacks an engine for its story. That type of page-turner quality that makes audiences want to keep going and going and going with it, never wanting it to end. The Batman is really just a series of well-made, nice to look at vignettes that just barely connect to each other because it's a serial killer mystery, but it's also an origin story. It's a lot of different things that they don't always lead into each other very well with that energy and propulsion that audiences crave from big budget action spectacle movies at this level, which partly explains why I think the ending, at least for me, it couldn't come soon enough because the story itself is just a bit too loose and meandering with all its various threads and pieces, all of which are technically and visually satisfying in their own ways. They're just not tied together to have that intentional, unmistakable quality that does what the best films do, which is not just entertain you, but change you. It's a high bar, obviously. So I'm very far away from saying this film is lesser or weak or bad for not clearing that bar. But it is notable that it jumps as high as it does and just barely comes short. That said, hardcore fans of Batman, they already have a built-in engine for digging through this movie and enjoying it. I mean, the character being put to film so confidently like this, that's enough of a page turner for a lot of people, a lot of fans. And I do expect that most people who already know, like, I can't wait to see it, I'm going to go see it first day and all that, they're going to walk out of this, I think, a lot of them thoroughly fulfilled, super excited for what's going to come next, wondering to themselves, is this the best Batman film ever? Is it close? Whatever. So for me, that's still The Dark Knight in terms of like what's the best one. And for me, it's Dark Knight by a pretty big margin, with Batman Begins pretty close behind. But I'd say the Batman, it's not far off. It really isn't. It's an exciting new reboot for a franchise I think really needed this. It needed a back to basics reset and a fresh coat of paint. It's kind of what the Tom Holland, Spider-Man movies have been for the Spider-Man franchise, but we're kind of doing that for Batman. And I think it works out pretty well here. Now, Batman opens in theaters this Friday, so you'll be able to see it for yourself, see if I'm totally full of it, if I'm nitpicking and all that stuff. I probably am. I certainly enjoyed this. Yeah, it went a little bit too long for me, and it's definitely one of those movies that I could see myself liking it a lot more the second, third, fourth time and what have you. I certainly appreciate a lot of stuff in it, and I'm excited to have an even longer, more comprehensive discussion about this film in the week ahead via Cinemaholics and other things. So as always, just subscribe here, subscribe to me on Cinemaholics and all that fun stuff if you're curious about any of that. But that's it for me. Next, we have a bunch of other things coming out soon. I'm going to be seeing Turning Red tomorrow, I'll probably be watching that movie like as this is coming out because of the embargo for the Batman and all of that. But until then, I will see you all for the next one.